Welcome to the Nebraska Department of Education's Professional Learning Module, Supporting English Learners in English Language Arts. I'm Brooke David, Title III Assistant Director at the Nebraska Department of Education. This webinar will take approximately 45 minutes. However, throughout the video, there are places to pause and reflect, so that is just an approximate length of time. If you have questions about supporting or serving English learners after you participate in this webinar, please look for more resources and information on the Department's Title III website listed on the screen. Here's our umbrella question. How can classroom teachers support English learners at varying levels of English proficiency during English language arts lessons? Today we will explore levels of English language proficiency and go through a process for determining supports for English learners in your lessons. There will be time during this webinar to look at one of your own lessons, so be sure to have one available. If you would prefer, there is a sample lesson available to use in the viewing guide as well. Page 3 of the viewing guide includes the objectives for this webinar. In this webinar, you will explore the shift in English language proficiency, or ELP standards, connect student characteristics to levels of English language proficiency, examine supports for English learners at different levels of English language proficiency, and practice integrating ELA and ELP standards and add English learner supports into your own lessons. Also on that page, you can find the materials you will need to complete this webinar. If you need to gather materials, pause the webinar now. If you can't get all the materials together, you can still go through this webinar without them. Please note, Nebraska is part of the ELPA 21 Assessment Consortium. The following information concerning ELP standards is adapted from the ELPA 21 Professional Development Learning Modules. If you are interested in more professional learning opportunities around the ELP standards, please visit elpa21.org. In 2014, the Nebraska State Board of Education approved Nebraska's College and Career Ready standards in English language arts. The new standards signal an upward shift in the knowledge, skills, and abilities students must develop to be college and career ready in the 21st century. And although content areas, particularly English language arts, have always been linguistically demanding, the new standards make language demands and practices more evident. Take some time to reflect on these questions. Please pause the video for a moment to respond on page 4 of your viewing guide to these questions. If you are able, share with your colleagues. Press play when you are ready to resume. It is important to have a general understanding of the Nebraska ELP standards as you think about supporting English learners in the general education classroom. The new Nebraska ELP standards follow the shift in content standards, with an emphasis on analytical thinking, communicating, and applying knowledge, and are meant to guide both academic and language development. The standards were developed for all grade levels, kindergarten through 12. Highlight the language necessary to engage in content-specific practices as well as vocabulary and grammar, and are meant to be used by both ELL teachers and content teachers. The ELP standards are not separate from content area learning, but are instead designed to complement and support that work. This graphic, found on page 5 of your viewing guide, demonstrates the difference between the previous versions of ELP standards and the new standards. First, while old standards promoted using simplified texts and activities, the new standards advocate for intellectually challenging activities that include language scaffolds to promote access to grade-level texts and deeper learning. Secondly, researchers and practitioners' views on language development and the way ELLs are taught have shifted from seeing English as a set of rules with discrete skills that are at the center of instruction toward an expanded view of language as a social process. Now, traditional grammar terms such as noun, verb, clause, etc. are not ignored but are embedded as part of a meaningful content-specific activity. Finally, the new ELP standards also reconceptualize the relationship between ELP and content standards. Previously, English language development and content learning were thought of as being sequential. English language proficiency was something that students had to demonstrate before digging into deep content learning. The new standards are not precursors but are on equal footing with content standards. They were designed to correspond with college and career-ready standards across all content areas to support ELL's academic language development and engagement in disciplinary learning. There are 10 core English language proficiency standards for all grade levels. These 10 core ELP standards are differentiated and broken down into progressions according to grade level bands. The 10 ELP standards shift the focus from what language does a student have to what is a student able to do with language within content areas. Standards 1 through 7 involve the language necessary for English learners to engage in content-specific practices associated with ELA and literacy, mathematics, and science. In other words, they focus on linguistic and analytical functions. They begin with a focus on extraction of meaning and then progress to engagement in the content-specific practices. Standards 8 through 10 demonstrate the language forms that are important to focus on, but only in the service of the other 7 standards. The ELP standards were created to provide clear expectations of student language use, progressions, and competencies. An essential feature of the new ELP standards is that the 10 core standards are applicable to every grade level. However, the standards are also organized by grade level bands, and within each grade level band, 5 different proficiency levels are detailed. Grade level bands include kindergarten, grade 1, grades 2 through 3, grades 4 through 5, grades 6 through 8, and grades 9 through 12. Keep in mind that while the 10 core standards are the same at each grade level band, the 5 proficiency levels will be different across grade level bands according to the developmental capacities of a typical student at the grade level band. Take a look at the matrix showing the proficiency levels for Standard 1 in kindergarten. The standard listed on the left-hand side is the same as Standard 1 from the 10 core standards. An ELL can construct meaning from oral presentations and literary and informational text through grade-appropriate listening, reading, and viewing. Across the top of the matrix, there are 5 proficiency levels for each standard, and in each box below is a proficiency level descriptor, which describes what a student should be able to do by the end of each level for that standard. For instance, in kindergarten for Standard 1, students at Level 1 language proficiency should be able to, with prompting and support, use a very limited set of strategies to identify a few keywords from read-alouds and oral presentations of information or stories. By Level 5, however, they should be able to, with prompting and support, use a wide range of strategies to identify main topics, answer questions about key details, retell familiar stories from read-alouds, picture books, and oral presentations. Now that we have reviewed the ELP standards, reflect on the following questions. Please pause the video for a moment and think about your answers to these questions and write them in the viewing guide. If you are able, share with your colleagues. Press play when you are ready to resume. There is not one program model that a district must use to support English learners. Depending on the program model and the number of English learners in the district, EL students with varying levels of proficiency will be in the general education classroom. This is why it is important that the person in charge of the English language development or ESL teacher for the district work with the English language arts teacher to help support English learners in the classroom. It is also important that the English language arts teacher and/or classroom teacher understand the supports they might put in place to help English learners in their classroom. English learners may need different types of supports in the general education classroom based on their level of English language proficiency. Even though the ELP standards show 5 levels of proficiency, districts may have different ways of determining levels for English learners. For the purpose of this webinar and for discussing proficiency and supports, we have collapsed levels of 1 through 5 into 3 levels so that all districts can use this model. The 3 levels of proficiency that we are going to use today are emerging, progressing, and nearly proficient. To clarify, the ELP standards include 5 levels of English language proficiency. To discuss supports, we've collapsed these levels into 3 categories, which we are calling emerging, progressing, and nearly proficient. To understand the 3 levels of English language proficiency, the group will work together to complete a card sort to discuss the student characteristics of students at the 3 levels of emerging, progressing, and nearly proficient. The materials for the card sort can be found at the end of the viewing guide. At this time, pause the video to complete the card sort. When you are finished, press play again to check your answers. Here are the typical student characteristics of English learners who would be considered emerging. These students will need the most support in the classroom. They are mostly newcomers and are just beginning to use familiar English structures and vocabulary. Often these students go through what is called a silent period, which means they are processing information but may not be producing much English yet. These students are still engaging and learning but aren't ready to produce English. In time, they will begin to produce some words and sentences when they are ready to do so. Students who are considered progressing may be in this stage for a while depending on many factors, such as native language literacy level, age, and academic background. These students are probably becoming more proficient in social English, but will still need more support in developing academic language skills. Students at the beginning of this level will need support in the classroom, but as students advance through this level, some supports may be able to be taken away or changed to be more appropriate. Students who are nearly proficient are almost ready to exit the English Learner program. The level of service for these students will probably look quite different than those at other levels of proficiency. Often these students have one domain they need more support in, for example, reading. Nearly proficient students are often in general education classrooms and will need additional support from the classroom teacher, particularly in academic language. If you would like, pause the video again to check your answers. A complete chart of the proficiency level descriptions for English learners can be found in your viewing guide. It's important to note that even though a student is considered proficient and has been exited from the English learner status, former English learners may still need support in the classroom. In order for a student to be considered proficient and no longer be designated as an English learner, the student would have to have scored all 4s or 5s on the annual summative English language proficiency assessment, the ELPA 21, in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Even though these students are no longer designated as English learners and are considered former English learners, they often need support accessing academic vocabulary and content-specific knowledge and skills, and it is completely appropriate for them to continue to have classroom supports. In fact, these students should be monitored for 4 years after they exit the English learner status. You may already know the level of the English learners in your class. If your district has provided you with the levels of your students, great. Use those levels to determine whether your students are emerging, progressing, or nearly proficient by using the descriptors we just reviewed, or by looking at the viewing guide. Another option of determining the levels of your students is by asking for their ELPA 21 results from the ELL program administrator in your district or building. The ELPA 21 is the annual summative assessment that English learners take each spring. By looking at the scores in reading, writing, speaking, and listening, you should be able to determine a student's level. Here is a sample of an ELPA 21 individual student report. This sample score report can be found on page 9 of your viewing guide. Note, this is just a sample report. Actual student reports may look slightly different, but will include the same information. In the sample on the screen and in the viewing guide, this 6th grade student has scored a 5 in listening, a 3 in reading, a 4 in speaking, and a 5 in writing. This student would be considered nearly proficient. The student has high scores in listening, speaking, and writing, but scored a 3 in reading, and therefore would not be determined proficient. However, since the student is very close to being proficient, we would consider this student nearly proficient. Note, the proficiency status does not match the levels of proficiency that we discussed today. There is no nearly proficient status on ELPA 21. Instead, those students would also be considered progressing. It might be the case that a student has yet to take the ELPA 21 summative assessment. The district administrator should have results from a screener. A screener is an initial English language proficiency assessment that identifies whether or not a potential English learner needs English language program support. You could look at this score to determine the student's levels. If the student has taken the ELPA 21 screener, the score reports will be similar to this one. You may even have classroom assessments that you can use to determine your students' levels. If you are unable to obtain assessment results again, look at the descriptions of English language proficiency to best determine a general level for your students. This template found on page 10 of the viewing guide may help you to organize your students' levels and document supports for these students. You may want to take time to pause the video to fill out the individual proficiency profile chart with the information of English learners in your class. Fill out the domain levels and proficiency level based on the assessment results you have. Refer back to the proficiency level card sort that you completed earlier to determine if the student is emerging, progressing, or nearly proficient. For other student characteristics, consider things that may affect the types of supports the student may need in the classroom. Consider things such as student's literacy level in his or her native language, previous school experiences, student strengths, interests, and anything else you know about the student that may determine the best way to support him or her. You can complete the classroom supports and evaluations of support columns later. If time permits, pause the video now to complete the chart and discuss students you share in common with your colleagues. You may be asking, now that I know my students' levels, how do I support them in my ELA lessons or literacy blocks? You may have already tried some strategies and supports that have worked for English learners in your classroom. Please pause the video for a moment and write your answers in the viewing guide. If you are able, share with your colleagues. Press play when you are ready to resume. English language arts lessons are often language and culturally based, which can present a challenge for English learners. English learners can better access grade level content when teachers apply classroom supports to their lessons. The Nebraska Department of Education conducted an English language arts and English language proficiency standards alignment in May 2017. As a result of this alignment work, the ELA and ELP working group created a resource that includes appropriate supports for English learners in comprehension, writing, and reciprocal communication lessons. The entire document can be found on the Title III NDE website and the ELA Sit Tool website under English Learners. Links to those websites are in the viewing guide. Today we will present parts of that document, including suggested supports for ELA lessons and some sample lesson plans with integrated supports. It is important to note that not all supports will be appropriate for every lesson and every student. We want to emphasize the supports are put into place to make the content more accessible for English learners, not to lower expectations. English learners come to the classroom with a wealth of knowledge and experiences. It is important to set high yet reasonable expectations of English learners while providing them with more appropriate supports to access your lessons. Later in this webinar, you will have a chance to work through a similar process for adding supports into your own lessons. The English Language Arts K-12 standards are divided into 4 strands: reading, writing, speaking, listening, and multiple literacies. For this webinar, we will focus on supports for reading, writing, and speaking listening. During reading lessons and activities, students learn and apply reading skills and strategies to comprehend text. This chart contains suggested supports when working with English learners on standards related to reading comprehension. The chart can also be found in your viewing guide. Please note that these supports are just suggestions, and depending on the lesson and skills and strengths of the student, some of these supports may be more appropriate than others. Also, this chart contains a column for older learners, grades 6 through 12. While these supports may be appropriate for any English learner, it is important to recognize that older English learners may need more supports because of the increased grade level skills expected in these grades. If time permits, pause the video to look over these suggestions and discuss them with your colleagues. During writing activities, students learn and apply writing skills and strategies to communicate. This chart contains suggested supports when working with English learners on standards related to writing processes and writing modes. This chart can be also found in your viewing guide. Again, these supports are just suggestions, and depending on the lesson and skills and strengths of the student, some of these supports may be more appropriate than others. There is also a column for older learners because of the increased grade level skills expected in writing in these grades. Again, if time permits, pause the video to look over these suggestions and discuss with your colleagues. In reciprocal communication lessons, students develop and apply appropriate speaking and listening skills and strategies to communicate for a variety of purposes. This chart contains suggested supports when working with English learners on standards related to speaking and listening. It is very important to support English learners in developing their oral language proficiency in English. This chart can also be found in your viewing guide. If time permits, pause the video to look over these suggestions and discuss them with your colleagues. As you may have noticed, many of the supports are similar regardless of the type of English language art lesson, and many ELA lessons integrate reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Generally, students at the emerging level can benefit from supports like non-linguistic representation, such as visuals and graphic organizers. Other supports, such as sentence starters and sentence frames, can also be helpful at this level. Students will benefit from one-on-one support, modeling, and samples. They may also need to demonstrate their knowledge in a different manner than other students in the class. Progressing students will generally benefit from support such as partnering with other students, supplemental information to build background knowledge, models of expectations, vocabulary supports such as anchor charts, lists, and word banks, and opportunities to build their oral language proficiency through discussion. Students who are nearly proficient often need fewer supports than other English learners. Generally, these students will benefit from building background information, building and supporting academic language development, and providing time for students to collaborate and discuss their ideas. As mentioned earlier, the supports listed for older learners may be appropriate for all students. However, notice that even older learners may need appropriately leveled texts and supplemental resources. They will also need a lot of background knowledge, particularly if they have not had the coursework or previous schooling experiences that other students in that grade have had. Now that you've had an overview of appropriate supports for English learners and have had time to discuss these supports with your colleagues, pause the video and go back to your student individual profile chart. Discuss supports that you think would help English learners in your class access the English language arts curriculum and standards. Later, when you try out some of these supports, come back to this chart and analyze the effectiveness of these supports to determine if they are appropriate for that particular student. Another way to think about supporting English learners is to analyze your lessons for places where English learners will need support. Here's a sample process meant for classroom teachers to look at their own ELA lessons, determine the standards addressed, and decide which supports are most appropriate for English learners. For this part of the webinar, you will need a sample ELA lesson. If you don't have one, there is a sample lesson plan in the viewing guide to use for this activity. If it helps to look at some samples of this process, you can find a link to sample lessons on the NDE Title III website under Standards. These samples were created during the ELA-ELP alignment by experts in both English language arts and English language proficiency. The process on the screen is the same process that was used to put together these samples. At any time, pause the video to look over the samples to help you as you work through this process now. First, you will need to decide which standards you are supporting in your lesson. As a language arts teacher, you probably have already established the ELA standard or standards that you are addressing. To determine how you are meeting both sets of standards, look at the ELP standards and select a standard that is also being met in this lesson. Refer back to page 6 of your viewing guide to see the 10 overall ELP standards. For a more detailed look at the ELP standards by grade band, please refer to the Title III Standards website. Pause the video to settle on the ELA and ELP standards that you are addressing in your lesson. When you have done that, play the video again. Now look through your lesson. Think about the activities that English learners may find challenging due to the linguistic demands of the lesson. You should consider the materials you are using, how students are interacting, the instructional expectation, and any outcomes that you are expecting of students. Think about where English learners may feel overwhelmed in this lesson. Pause the video to highlight and discuss where the challenges for English learners may be in this lesson. Finally, look back at the 3 charts with suggestions for supporting English learners. Remember, there are suggested supports for comprehension lessons, writing lessons, and reciprocal communication lessons. We suggest that you add supports for all 3 levels of English proficiency, even if you don't have students at that proficiency level currently in your classroom. It may be that students at different levels of proficiency will come into your class at different times of the year. Pause the video to discuss with your colleagues and determine the best supports for your lesson. Once you have completed these activities, discuss with your colleagues the supports you put in place for English learners in your lesson. Thank you for taking the time to learn about supporting English learners. The purpose of this webinar was to provide English language art teachers with some ideas to support English learners in the general education classroom. We hope that you have been able to get ideas and have had rich conversations with your colleagues around the best ways to assist English learners access grade level curriculum. That brings us to the end of our webinar. If you have more questions about supporting English learners, visit the Title III website for more information.